Hello, this is Dr. Moy. This represents the first in a series of educational material designed for the layperson to better understand cancer research and the process that governs it. In 1971, Richard Nixon declared war on cancer. While there is no question there has been scientific advancement in the field of cancer, we are far from realizing a cure for this disease. This raises the fundamental question of what is preventing medical cures for cancer. Since 1971, society has spent trillions of dollars in cancer research. Yet, despite all the money spent, cancer remains one of the most challenging diseases to overcome. This begs the question whether we are approaching this disease in the wrong way. Einstein once said, "The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result." I believe that this quote by Einstein is somewhat applicable to the field of cancer treatment and research. Thus, the title of my talk is it time to fundamentally change cancer research and treatment? Before we try to find cures for cancer, we first have to acknowledge the problems and challenges of cancer. Cancer patients make up less than 1% of the patient population, but consume 10% of the healthcare costs, according to insurance industry data. $26 billion is spent annually on chemotherapy, but only a third of these patients are achieving remission. 22% of cancer patients receive chemotherapy, but the 5-year survival from it has only increased by a modest 2%. Chemotherapy patients generate 4 times more cost per year, typically over $110,000 a year in healthcare costs, than non-chemotherapy patients. We also have a very poor track record in finding cures for cancer. There is a 95% attrition or failure rate due to low proven efficacy in clinical trials. Just in 2012 and 2013, 7 out of the 20 top drugs in clinical trials that failed were cancer drugs. $1.5 billion and 12 years of research and development is required to get a drug approved for the mass market. Keep in mind that an issued patent is granted to a pharmaceutical company for 20 years of exclusivity to develop and finally profit from their new drug. This, in effect, leaves 8 years for drug companies to recoup their developmental costs and achieve sufficient profits to initiate research and development for the next round of drugs. And surprisingly, less than 5% of cancer patients actually enroll in clinical trials. Well, what is the typical drug development process? Well, there are 4 phases. The first phase is called the preclinical phase. This is the phase in which new drugs are developed and designed and finally optimized to maximize their activity and safety profile, and then ultimately tested for safety in animals. This is an FDA prerequisite before a clinical trial can be initiated, and it typically costs between $4 to $6 million and 3 to 5 years of development time. Once this has been accomplished, a drug can enter into a clinical trial. There are 3 phases during the clinical trial. Phase 1 involves the first clinical phase to test a drug safety in a small group of patients. Phase 2 involves the second clinical phase to test for drug efficacy in a small group of patients. And lastly, phase 3 involves the third clinical phase to test for drug efficacy and safety in a large group of patients. Well, then what is the typical clinical trial success rate for investigational oncology drugs? The data is illustrated on the left. For phase 1 trials, there is a 65% success rate. Alternatively, there is a 35% drug failure rate for a phase 1 study. While that may not seem so bad, the situation gets worse for phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials. The failure rate is 65% and 55% respectively for phase 2 and 3 clinical trials. What this translates to is that there is a 1 out of 10 chance that a new cancer drug will ever succeed past a phase 3 trial. Stated in another way, for one drug to succeed and get finally approved, 10 drugs must be in the pipeline and get tested. Now, these statistics have held up no matter what type of class of drug is being tested over time. So the conclusion from this data is that we're hitting a wall somewhere in the sense that there is a fundamental knowledge gap in our understanding in how we design cancer therapies and clinical trials. So what are the research costs associated with the clinical trial? The data, again, is illustrated on the left. On average, phase 1 trials cost $4 million. Phase 2 trials cost $10 million, and a phase 3 trial costs almost $42 million. As shown, it's clear that testing for drug efficacy is the major cost driver. But remember, since it requires 10 drugs in the pipeline to achieve one drug success, the actual society costs are $40 million for evaluating drug safety and almost $500 million for evaluating drug efficacy. So the conclusion is the only way to reduce the cost of drug development is to improve the predictability of drug efficacy before a drug actually enters into a clinical trial. Well, what is the timeline for clinical trials? The data shown on the left demonstrates that it takes 8 years to complete a clinical trial from phase 1 through phase 3. But remember, only 5% of cancer patients are actually enrolled in clinical trials. So chances are very low that anyone diagnosed with cancer today is going to benefit from research and development dollars. The majority of cancer patients are not benefiting from clinical trials or medical research for whatever reasons. So the conclusion is, since there is such a high drug failure rate in clinical trials, and only a small percent of cancer patients are directly benefiting from medical research expenditures, it begs the question whether society should shift some focus in its medical research operation to improve the lives of patients that have cancer now or will be diagnosed with cancer tomorrow. So to summarize, there are significant limits and huge costs to chemotherapy. Cancer drug development has the highest drug failure rate, and there are fundamental knowledge gaps in our understanding of cancer biology that are preventing successful drug development. Medical research expenditures are going towards helping the theoretical patient of tomorrow in years to come, and not helping to a great degree the patients suffering from cancer today or who will contract cancer soon. So there needs to be improvements in predicting drug efficacy, which will be key to improve current medical treatments and improve outcomes in drug development. And such improvements are needed in information systems in order to recruit patients for clinical trials, which are suffering from very poor clinical trial patient recruitment challenges. So what is JP2MRI doing to address these challenges? From this background, it's clear that there is a need to create a different paradigm in cancer research. We're focusing on understanding the fundamental knowledge gaps in cancer biology that prevent drug efficacy. We're collaborating with strategic partners to improve drug efficacy predictability. We're collaborating with strategic partners to improve information systems to decrease research and development costs and time and drug failure rate. And we're collaborating with strategic partners to improve information systems to improve cancer patient recruitment. We will specifically address these approaches in upcoming presentations. The next session will address the topic, what are the main constituents of cancer? Taking a holistic approach. Remember, your donations go toward supporting this medical research. JP2MRI is a 501c3 nonprofit that specializes in finding cures and better therapies exclusively using a variety of adult stem cells. JP2MRI is one of only a handful of pro-life medical research organizations that does not support or participate in any form of embryonic stem cell research. The Institute devotes over 55% of each dollar donated to scientific research, while most national not-for-profit medical research foundations devote much less of their budget to actual medical research. Further, the Institute is entirely focused on reducing the time and cost to get therapies through the regulatory process. To learn more about JP2MRI, go to our website, www.jp2mri.org, and consider a donation. Also, tell your family, friends, schools, and church groups and social media networks about the Institute. Thank you.